Thank you very much, Hub, for accepting my invitation. I'm really pleased to talk to you after having read your brilliant book on laughter. So I have an introductory note about you, and then we will go to the questions. So Hub Zwart studied philosophy and psychology at Radboud University, worked as a research associate in the Center for Bioethics in Maastricht, and defended his thesis in 1993. In 2000, he became full professor of philosophy at the Faculty of Science. In 2018, he was appointed as Dean of Erasmus School of Philosophy, Erasmus University of Rotterdam. He has published 15 books, as far as I know, and over 100 academic papers. In his research, he develops a continental philosophical perspective on contemporary technoscience. Special attention is given to genres of imagination, novel, plays, poetry, in research and education. So basically, we are talking about your book, Ethical Concepts of Truth and Laughter. So the first question for me, I mean, it's more like requiring you to elaborate on some of your positions in the book, is that you say that a laughter that not only rejects but also affirms. You have dealt elaborately with philosophers of laughter, namely Michael Bakhtin, Friedrich Nietzsche, Georges Bataille, and Michel Foucault, in order to retrieve a basic understanding of laughter as a phenomena of philosophical significance. What brought you to laughter, Hub?
Yeah, well, that's a long story, but to make it very short, I was puzzled by the concept of consensus. Can we come to an agreement in a world with many views and languages and perspectives? And my concern was that we live in a world which seems quite pluralistic, but at the same time there is a dominant ideology. And this dominant ideology has a very specific rationality. Mm-hmm. And if you have a critical point of view, you have to adopt this dominant rationality to articulate your views. But what happens if this dominant ideology, this dominant rationality, doesn't allow you to express your views and your experiences? Mm-hmm. Because very often that can be the case, that the language of the dominant rationality isn't your language or isn't adequate to articulate your experience or your concern. And then what very often happens is that, you are either rejected and not allowed entrance to the debate because you don't use the proper terms or the proper arguments, or you accept your fate, but that results in unease or discontent because you can't really identify with the dominant view, but you don't have the tools, so to speak, to phrase your criticism. And then I noticed that besides discontent, there is another opportunity, because all of a sudden you notice the dominant rationality and also its blind spots, its gaps, and sometimes laughter opens this up, reveals this, shows that this dominant rationality has a very specific focus, which can be a strong focus, but it also has its weaknesses, its blind spots. And there are moments of laughter, so to speak, when this is revealed. So that's the critical moment. But in this laughter, also other possibilities of thinking, other perspectives loom up, so to speak, and emerge. Mm-hmm. So laughter has at that point a critical function. It shows that positions which seem self-evident are actually quite questionable. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, via laughter, you can get access to a completely different point of view, a completely different experience, and that's the positive side. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. What's very interesting, and what was very interesting in reading the book for me, was that you have made some distinction between different forms of laughter, but not based on like it's not like behavioral categorization of laughter. Rather, you make this distinction between true laughter versus subdued laughter. I mean, there is a distinction, and several genres of laughter, notably parody and irony, are analyzed. The main and frequent theme of the book seems to highlight the fact that parody must be regarded as a decisive form of laughter. What is true laughter, Hub?
Yeah, I would say irony, which is yeah, kind of marginal humor, so to speak. So you play a little game, but you don't really contest or confront the dominant rationality. You go along with it. You laugh a little bit, subdued, very careful, but it's not really a challenging laugh. Parody is already completely different. If you use parody, you you seem to follow and accept and adopt the dominant logic, but in such a way that at the same time it's clear that you don't accept it at all. You show its weaknesses by, let's say, overemphasizing some of its aspects, which are actually quite questionable. By doing that, you reveal the questionability, so to speak, of this dominant rationality. And you're playing a game, but it's much more confrontational, because if parody works, and then all of a sudden you become aware how questionable some of your techniques and your tools and your arguments actually are. So parody is already an important step. And then, and finally, the big laugh, so to speak, the roaring laughter, when all of a sudden you have this experience of liberation. I'm not at all dependent on this dominant rationality. I have now found the language, the words, the freedom to express myself and to develop a completely different point of view. And that's an experience of revelation and of liberation, so to speak. And also that is accompanied by laughter, and that would be something which I consider as genuine or true laughter. Yes.
Right. And I mean, the characteristic of the book, especially from the beginning, actually, is that you have devoted one chapter on morality. And there, I mean, the first chapter, let's say, and yes, you say that, I'm quoting you, the claim that moral philosophy is not yet a science, but could and therefore should be transformed in such a way that it might become a science, prevents us from recognizing the truly ethical in ethics. Do you think that ethics is a comic genre, and if so, how?
Yeah, absolutely. And well, you noticed that, and I gave various case studies, of course, of prominent philosophers who played an important role in the tradition of moral philosophy, who used laughter very explicitly. So Socrates, sometimes we refer to Socrates and his irony, but actually many let's say, of his philosophical exercises are actually parodies. So it's more, parody is more his genre, I would say, than irony, but I don't want to go into too much details. But that's a famous example, for example, of a philosopher, a moral philosopher, who uses laughter. And I also gave Luther, for example, as an example, because in his work, laughter, and ook loud laughter, real laughter, roaring laughter, plays an important role. So yes, I do think that laughter and ethics, that there is a connection, but especially at crucial moments, moments of real collision, when a dominant view is confronted with its limits and its constraints, and then when there is a kind of rupture or transition, and during those moments, when, for example, in the case of Socrates, we move from a mythological to a Apollonian worldview, or in the case of Luther, from a medieval Gothic to a early modern view, those points of those turns, those points of transition, then laughter can become really a very important moment, a very important experience.
Hub, let's stick to one of the main concepts that you apply in the first chapter of the book, namely compartmentalization. I mean, so as you take it from liberal ethics, let's say, I mean, you have the fact that, I'm quoting you again, true laughter is a moral experience of intrusion which challenges strategies of compartmentalization, preferably to the point of collapse. Socrates, for instance, was not a politician. He did not argue for political change in top-down sense of the term. He was a midwife, someone who, in defiance of the lifestyle acknowledged and fostered by the state, allowed unprecedented forms of moral subjectivity to establish themselves. Notably, lifestyles which engaged a critical philosophical practice, including cynicism. We go back to cynicism later, but what is the role of and function of laughter in relation to compartmentalization? Can you please elaborate on that?
Yeah, yes, I think, well, in my book, I was criticizing the dominant moral philosophy, which I called liberalism.
Mhm.
And one of the techniques of liberalism is indeed compartmentalization. So the idea is this is ethics, and this is what we discuss. And other aspects of experience, whether it's art or religion, etc., are excluded from that. We focus on a limited number of legitimate questions, and the rest is avoided. It's a method of avoidance. And I think that at a certain point, there is this experience of unease. This doesn't work. If you are inspired by art, or if you are inspired by religious views, or more in a more general way, by worldviews, then you can't simply limit your ethical arguments to this small set of legitimate arguments, which are quite technical. It's about self-determination, about risks, etc. And all other things are excluded from the debate. And all of a sudden you realize that this is actually a strategy of exclusion. Now the protagonists of this strategy try to remove a lot of views and experiences from the debate. But if you want to have a real moral debate, which really tries to come to terms with our concerns and our desires, then you have to open up. So and then we need these other voices, these challenging experiences, these challenging voices, to develop a broader, more comprehensive, more truthful view, because otherwise we are much too restricted. So we shouldn't accept that strategy. And if you are forced into that strategy, all of a sudden, well, laughter can be a liberating moment.
And again, what's interesting is that, I mean, what stands out in the book is the fact that your starting point is using laughter as a form of, let's say, affirmative critique against morality. Yet this morality is not necessarily the traditional, as you said, like religious, dogmatic morality instrumentalized by religion or any ideology, but the new form of morality, namely morality embedded in liberalism. Many scholars of laughter and humor, however, highlight the role of laughter in overcoming various manifestations of traditional morality, from superstition to ideology. What do you think, why do you think it's necessary to start with what you called liberalism?
Yeah, because liberalism has this view that we are progressive. We leave all these old-fashioned doctrines behind. We are the future, we are the rational point of view, etc. But actually, what I try to show in my book, and that's a very important experience, I think, is that liberalism has its own orthodoxy, its own blind spots, its own methods of exclusion. So I don't necessarily want to go back to traditional views or to a very specific traditional morality. What I believe is that, and what I try to argue in my book, is that we are on the threshold of something new. So not something old, so not a relapse into traditional positions, but something new, something beyond liberalism. Because I do think that liberalism, first of all, is not able to articulate or allow us to articulate some very basic moral concerns, but also liberalism isn't able to live up to the challenges of the Anthropocene and the current ecological and political crisis. We need a new morality, and so we need to move beyond liberalism as the, let's say, the dominant point of view. Something else is emerging, and to be sensitive to that, we have to open up, and laughter can play a role in that. Well, putting away the restrictions, overcoming the restrictions.
Um, if I may, there one of the enemies of the book, let's say tacitly, is Richard Rorty, especially the ideas concerning irony. In the analysis of Richard Rorty's book, Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity, you add that, I'm quoting you, the ironic perspective on the human condition is valuable on a private level, but it cannot advance the social or political goals of liberalism. Do you claim implicitly that irony targets only private life?
Yes, absolutely. I criticize that because then, well, you may have all kinds of wild ideas in your private little room, but in public life, you have to adapt to the dominant morality of liberalism and its institutionalized forms. I think that's a very bad idea because, well, I think it's becoming increasingly clear that liberalism has many negative side effects. I mean, think about someone like John Stuart Mill, who wrote a book on liberty, while at the same time he was for, I think, 3 decades or something, involved in colonialism in India. He did the two things at the same time. He wrote on liberty and at the same time was involved in colonialism. That's just one example. We need to see that, yes, this dominant this dominant ideology of liberalism has its shadows. What we need to do is, like Friedrich Engels, who started to walk through Manchester in the 1840s and saw all the ecological and social disruption. We need a similar movement now. Yes, this liberal ideology seems very convincing, very rational, and many of its components do have value, but at the same time, there is a dark side to liberalism. Rorty voices the elite, and there is a long tradition, a long history in philosophy of siding with the elite view, grounding, supporting the dominant ideology. And I think philosophers should move away from that. We should problematize. We should question the dominant ideology because of its side effects. We see what is happening in the world: political disruption, ecological disruption. The ideology of liberalism plays a role in that. And in order to discern that, and in order to assess that, we need a much broader perspective. And moments of laughter can help us to develop that.
If I understood you correctly in your take on Plato and Socrates, the interesting thing is the concept of agora, the concept of like public life. And then when we come back to Rorty, you have this idea that, I'm quoting you, there is in my view, you say, in my view, the quintessence of Rorty's ethics of compartmentalization is his misunderstanding of laughter. There is clearly an awareness that laughter poses a threat to public regulation and that public mockery might imply political risks with regard to solidarity. Therefore, laughter is subdued and reduced to irony, excluded from the agora, the market square of unrestricted political discourse, public discourse.
I think the agora is a place where incompatible perspectives clash, meet each other, and are mutually exposed to one another. And that's very important, because if you marginalize these other views, maybe you dislike them, maybe you think they are threatening, etc. If you exclude them, then there will increasingly be a divide between the public debate with its limited set of valid arguments and experiences outside that debate, views emerging outside that debate. And if you allow this divide, this compartmentalization to emerge, then you end up with two worlds. And sooner or later, this will collapse. And so it's better to have a broader view where you try to give the floor also to views and experiences and forms of logic and forms of rationality, which you, for various reasons, dislike, but which nonetheless, I think, have a validity and right to exist of their own. And that's the real agora, where these clashes take place.
So one of the interesting facets of the book is that your take on Bakhtin and his concept of carnival in regard to laughter. There is a part that it seems that one of the prominent components in gay laughter for you is that it somehow attacks seriousness. And when it comes to Bakhtin and Rabelais, you say that, I quote you, the 17th century was marked by stabilization and seriousness, again, by the establishment of absolutism in the realm of politics, of rational philosophy, and classicist aesthetics. What exactly do you mean by this seriousness, and what is the function of laughter in regard to that? Are we actually suffering from seriousness now?
Well, very good question. Of course, my book was written in the 1990s, which is already some time ago, but times are changing. But let me start with Bakhtin and the carnival. I happen to come from an area in the Netherlands, in the very south, which is a Catholic area, and their carnival is very important. So I know it from experience. So I like to read his books on carnival because he explains that carnival is more than having fun, so to speak, or enjoying your life, but it has a purpose, and that's why carnival is present more or less in all cultures to some extent, in various forms, of course. But there are always moments, sometimes connected with spring or autumn, where all of a sudden the normal hierarchy, the normal order is reversed or opened up, and things are allowed, permitted, which are usually marginalized or not permitted or forbidden. And those are important moments of catharsis, so to speak. So when, and that is also a moment when in normal life you have, let's say, according to Bakhtin, the dominant language, the dominant morality, and this prescribes how in the public sphere, in the official sphere, people speak and talk and deliberate. But all of a sudden we are exposed to these other languages and these other genres, which are always there, but usually they are hidden or silenced, and all of a sudden they are giving the floor. And we have to accept that, and we are exposed to that, and we recognize that these other languages and other voices are also inside us. It's not something external, that we are divided subjects ourselves. And that's an important experience. And if you erase that, if you obliterate that, if you marginalize that, then in an era of seriousness, and that was indeed the case when modernity was established with absolutism and well, rationality and things like that. Then this other side of culture, this other dimension, which becomes manifest during carnivalesque festivals. This other side is silenced, and this is an impoverishment, resulting in discontent and other symptoms, you could say. And I recognize that, and I would say yes, we are now in entering a very serious era, where the dominant strategy seems to be, let's say, to focus on correctness, to limit the things you are allowed to say and not allowed to say, making things sensitive. And that's an interesting paradox, because on the one hand, we are living in a period, and I didn't discuss that in my book because it wasn't that urgent yet, but now we live in a period of inclusiveness, inclusion, which is very important. But what you very often see is that inclusion always presupposes a kind of filter. Yes, we want to include, but only the things we can include or can incorporate. Inclusion, at the same time, always is connected with an atmosphere or a strategy of exclusion. And that's very interesting and very important to notice that, yes, I'm very much in favor of inclusion. in various ways. And yes, we should open up. But what I also notice is this dominant ideology of inclusion, which also is very important in universities, for example. I'm not only a scholar, but also a dean. I have a managerial position, and I know this language of inclusion also as a manager, a dean. But we should be very much on the alert that this strategy of inclusion very often also has a strategy of exclusion, of filtering, saying, yes, we want to exclude this, but we don't want to exclude that. And what I try to convince people is to say that if you really want to be inclusive, if you really want to open up, if you really want debate, public debate or research to be more inclusive, you also have to open up to, for example, people who adhere to conspiracy theories and things like that, because that's out there, and we have to give the floor also to those voices, because otherwise you end up with demarcation, compartmentalization, as we called it in our previous meeting. This is serious culture. It includes many things, but also only those things which we want to include. And then there is another culture. It's on the dark web, or it's somewhere else, or on different platforms and on different websites. And then you end up having two different worlds. And sooner or later, they will clash. So I think a better strategy is a strategy of real exposure, to say that we also have to listen to voices which we find very problematic, or even repulsive, so to speak, or even quite out of order. Yet the logic of the carnivalesque, so to speak, says that every now and then we have to expose ourselves to that as well, to that otherness as well, because otherwise.
It's interesting.
Sorry for the long answer.
Yeah, it's interesting, but I mean, I have the impression that I can formulate it this way, that to a large extent, seriousness is the result of homogenization. I mean, seriousness happens only when there is some homogeneity. And so when we want to have this difference there, we can't be that serious. I mean, the core, at least epistemologically, is that when there is difference, it can't be that serious.
Yeah. So let me give a very concrete but also dangerous example. It wasn't there when I wrote the book, but when I saw it on television, I was reminded of Bakhtin and his ideas of the carnivalesque. It was in January this year when Capitol Hill was stormed. We all have seen it. We were all taken aback and very much surprised is too mildly a word. Shocked by what was happening. How is this possible? The headquarters of seriousness, of democracy, of policy and politics, all of a sudden stormed by a rather carnivalesque crowd, I would say. And carnival sounds nice, etc. But carnival always has a violent element. It can be very subdued, and then it's nice, but it can also be very manifest. So carnivalesque is not only nice. Carnivalesque also has this element of violence, of shock, of disruption. And well, we noticed that when Capitol Hill was stormed, we saw these carnivalesque figures, people with weird dresses, queer dresses, and very anarchistic, very chaotic, but also carnivalesque and colorful and laughing. So I think that was a very interesting and important moment, because on the one hand, you could say, from the perspective of seriousness, this is outrageous and we should prevent this. We should stop this. We should punish these people. It's completely wrong. It's a threat to democracy, etc. And it is. And this response, I think, is a response which, to some extent, I share, because I want to defend democracy. At the same time, I think if this happens, this catastrophe, this moment of collapse, so to speak, then something has gone wrong. Apparently, this headquarters of power, like Versailles in the past, has distanced itself too much from real life. I think that's what's happening on Capitol Hill. You have two parties, the Democrats and Republicans. They are fighting each other. They are making life difficult for each other. They listen very well to, let's say, all kinds of lobby organizations. But apparently, there is a kind of estrangement between the politicians, the official politicians, and their voters, the public out there, the audience out there, the silent majority out there. And if this distance becomes too large, then you will have happenings like this. It's not nice. It's violent. People were killed, but at the same time, I think this is something we should take seriously. At least Bakhtin advises us to take that seriously and say, what went wrong in our democracy? Because if democracy is flourishing, and if democracy is really inclusive, this won't happen, because apparently something went awry, something went wrong, and we have to. Well, of course, we have to punish people who caused the damage, but at the same time, we have to self-critically reflect on how could this happen, and what is going wrong in democracy? What is the crisis of democracy? Because apparently many people don't recognize themselves anymore in these political games we see on television every day. So that's for me a very important moment when the theory of Bakhtin becomes very relevant again.
And following this, let's say Bakhtinian understanding of laughter and seriousness, there is an actually you have devoted some part of the book to Michel Foucault, and it's not irrelevant to talk about inclusion and exclusion when it comes to madness and civilization, for example. Yeah, I mean, you have it's actually one of the main issues, especially when it comes to your analysis of the role of laughter in Foucault's philosophy in relation to folly and truth on the one hand, and seriousness and laughter on the other. As you put it, I'm quoting you, it's a kind of wisdom that turned official knowledge into folly, a profound insight and truth, a striking and revealing view on life. In short, it was an experience of madness or folly that Foucault felt was articulated brilliantly in Erasmus' praise of Folly. So it's related to exactly to what Foucault's project can be directed to.
Yeah, I quite agree. And once again, maybe we could use Capitol Hill as an example here, because you could say, well, these people storming Capitol Hill because they believe the elections were a fraud and they have other conspiracy theories. We can say that's pure madness. We want to exclude that from the political debate. We want to get rid of that. We want to punish these people, etc. And that's, let's say, the strategy of demarcation and the strategy of exclusion. We don't want to listen. But there is a moment of validity, I think, in their view. And that's where laughter comes in. Because if you look at what is Capitol Hill, you can have two responses. And many people, I think, at least I had, two responses. On the one hand, you have the response of shock. This is terrible. This is a threat for democracy. At the same time, many people, including myself, also saw the moment of laughter in this event, because all of a sudden, all these extremely serious politicians received this wake-up call, and all of a sudden the world was turned upside down, and all of a sudden powerful people felt very powerless, and all of a sudden the powerless felt very powerful. So this reversal. I mean, it's a threatening moment, it's a disruptive moment, it's not a very nice moment, and yet it is a moment when I think many people also will have smiled and said, "Wow, I never expected this could happen. This is at the same time fabulous or fantastic." And of course, I mean, these moments of disruption sometimes lead to very positive outcomes. If you storm the Bastille, in 1789, that was a kind of similar crowd, I guess, similarly violent, but we now still celebrate the end of the ancient regime. And I think it's very good that the Senate and the House is still there and that democracy survived. But at the same time, this moment of carnivalesque laughter, let us learn from that. Let us also see the moment of truth, to because if you don't use that, if you then your self-criticism is limited. You only look critically at yourself within your own genre, within this limited set of arguments and concepts which you have. But this is a moment where I think you are forced to open up and to notice that there may be some validity also in views which you want to keep at a distance and views which you don't want to listen to. If you do that, if you don't listen, then they will come and knock on your door. And that happened when they stormed Capitol Hill. So open up and listen and try to enter into a real dialogue. And laughter can be the moment when this is opened up and made possible again.
Yeah, it's interesting for me that I think in your understanding of laughter, which I actually agree with that basically, is that like like opening up to laughter is somehow also it also means something metaphorically, to open yourself to these rifts, to these gaps, to these cracks, to these moments, unexpected moments, this is contingency. And I see that in regard to Foucault again. Sorry, that in his reading of Nietzsche, you have this idea that, around 1970, Foucault's archaeology of medical, psychiatric, and psychological knowledge is transformed into a genealogy of power. And this transformation is already apparent in his transitional essay on Nietzsche, genealogy and history, in which genealogy is presented as a kind of laughter. It's interesting actually to know that for you, genealogy is a kind of laughter, a form of historical research which laughs at the metaphysical quest for lofty and divine origins.
Absolutely, because what is now very lofty and serious very often has a very humble origin. And that's basically genealogy. Most of the words we use have a very humble and physical origin, and etymology reveals that, and that's something. If you let's do a very short exercise. If you look from a Bakhtinian perspective on contemporary ethics, let's say, and let's take an ethical concept. Let's say privacy. If you look at
the main topic in your book.
Yeah. If you look at privacy from a genealogical perspective, privacy nowadays in contemporary ethics, it's a positive term. It's something we want to safeguard, which we want to respect. But privacy, if you look at it from a historical perspective, is actually a negative term. You are deprived of something, namely attention and connection with others. You're isolated, you're deprived of attention and care. So initially it was a negative term. Now we see it as something positive, but it was actually a negative term. And it meant sharing your life with others, also your private life. And private life also has a physical aspect, the private parts of your life, also in a physical sense, sharing a bathroom, sharing a bed, etc. So if you, in neoliberalism, if you focus very much on privacy as the most important thing in life, we want to keep everything private. I can imagine that, but then you also miss something, namely sharing your life also in a physical sense, and you're deprived of this sharing even of the most private things of your life and physical existence. And at a certain point, if you become very dependent, you can't hide these private parts anymore. You have to be taken care of by others. And so that's the privacy discussion, of course, nowadays. Where does privacy stop and where can it be upheld? And but if you look at it from an historical perspective, this adds a dimension. And I think, yeah, again, Bakhtin or Nietzsche would smile if they say, look here, this is the origin of the word privacy. It's connected with private parts and bodily existence and things like that. So there is a kind of, well, moment of laughter in every genealogy, because very often our very serious words have a very physical and humble origin.
I mean, you provided me with a couple of examples which were really interesting, but I can also give you an example of my own experience of living here. I come from a country which is very dramatically different from this culture. I come from Iran. I lived like 28 years and like 12 years now in Europe, and mainly I've been residing in Germany. So one of the first things that I noticed in the beginning of living in Germany for me was that this culture, in comparison, of course, I am overgeneralizing, I admit that, but the tendency in this culture was for me very much ironic. I mean, so irony is very present in daily life here. And it was for me actually something new, because the dominance of morality here is so much, and I am so overwhelmed with morality, that these moments of laughter happens very rarely. And it is no wonder that I see that it's a serious culture. And of course, the other side of the coin is that is an efficient culture. That is a functional culture. It is functioning. It's one of the best economies in the world. Yeah. But the other side of the coin for me was that, wow, it is too serious. And how much the private life, as you put it, is influenced by public life. So actually, for me, like when I compare it, like boldly, of course, I'm a bit exaggerating. I come from a background that private life was more appreciated, and to a culture, that private life is actually just a kind of imitation of public life and public morality.
Yeah, I recognize what you say. I've never lived in Iran, of course, so I can't judge that the way you can. But I do agree that, well, first of all, indeed, I think this distinction, this demarcation or compartmentalization between private and public. This is what we do in private. This is what we do in public. I think that's typically Western, and even you could say typically Protestant. I think if you look at it again from a historical perspective, the Protestant morale is you live in a world where people try to make money and utilitarian rationality is dominant. And in your private life, you're, for example, very devoted and you're a Christian, etc. But these are two worlds. In Catholic culture, this is already different, I would say. So it's especially in the more Protestant parts of Europe where this, for example, in the Catholic parts of Germany, you have carnival every year. So that's, But, and I agree that in our Western cultures, irony is very important. For example, when you go to the United Kingdom, especially to England, I noticed that humor is in every sentence. But of course, irony is a very subdued form of laughter. It doesn't really confront. It's not confrontational. It doesn't really challenge. It reveals that people know that this limited official serious morality leaves out many things and is maybe too strict in many ways, and maybe a very impoverished view of life. And I know that there are other opportunities and other possibilities, but I don't really dive into that. It's mildly ironic, so to speak. And of course, the carnivalesque and gay laughter, as Bakhtin phrases it, real laughter, loud laughter. That only happens when you really are able to distance yourself and to go beyond the constraints of a particular dominant ideology.
You're also referring to the parts of the book you talk about Georges Bataille, and again, his understanding of laughter as a philosopher of laughter. It seems that, I mean, one of the reasons of exclusion of laughter is that there is an inherent violence in laughter. There is an inherent expulsion in laughter.
Yeah, that's true. So that's also why laughter is not innocent, and uh, also in, let's say, plays or novels or movies where real laughter occurs, that can be a very disruptive moment.
Mm,
And of course, after this moment of laughter, we have to work on, let's say, containment or denouement
mm,
or catharsis or bringing things together again, because
right.
laughter can also get out of hand.
Mm,
And I was recently, I saw an interesting movie, a Danish movie. I like Danish movie. So it was called Truk, I think. So that means being drunk or something like that. It's a film about alcohol, and it's a movie about four high school teachers who are in a midlife crisis, who don't enjoy life anymore, who think life is much too serious, and they feel very restricted and very limited and very depressed. And to help themselves, they start to drink every day a certain amount. And what they notice is that for a certain period of time, this enhances their well-being and their performance. They open up. They are able to use their talents and resources in a more creative way. But of course, at a certain point, there is disruption, and but I think that the morale of the movie is alcohol doesn't solve your problems, but we should find a way to every now and then to open up and to well,
mm,
retouch, rediscover the basis of our commitment and creativity, because otherwise, in a purely serious and rationalized world, yeah, we get lost. We run into a midlife crisis, and we
mm,
forget why
mm,
we wanted to become a teacher in the first place, for example.
mm. Hub, one of the other facets of the book, towards the end of the book, is when it comes to criticism. One of the main tenets of this book is that criticism has been a very serious issue, devoid of quick-wittedness and the presence of the mind. This takes you to Sloterdijk, to a very I mean, famous but also infamous German Dutch philosopher, and the comparison between cynicism and kineticism. Interestingly, kineticism, if I correctly pronounce it, I think it is kineticism, yeah? Triggers not only a public laughter, but also a direct laughter and an immediate affirmative cheerfulness. Quoting you, you say that, yet true kineticism suffered a dramatic decline, and today the bold, impudent rogue has become marginalized. Already during the Protestant era, laughter was transformed into mere satire, and although its critical aspect has survived, modern criticism has become a serious matter and distanced itself from the traditions of laughter to which it historically belongs. Thus, although modern criticism is of comic descent and critical philosophy is heir to a popular tradition of comic resistance, we hardly seem to be aware of the fact that since time immemorial, moral criticism was connected with laughter.
Yeah, correct. I quite agree. Yeah.
You agree with your code.
No, that's an important point, because yes, I agree with Sloterdijk. I like his work very much. I I also had the honor of meeting him once or twice,
Mm,
and I'm always indeed overwhelmed by his erudition, for example. So I take his work very seriously.
mm,
But I think he has a very important point. So when we use the word cynicism, we use cynicism in the contemporary sense of the world, of the word, which means it's a form of laughter, but a very cynical form of laughter. So
mm,
it's restricted, it's negative, but well, you could say Sloterdijk takes a genealogical approach. He goes back into history and he asks himself, what did cynicism mean in the 2000 years ago,
mm,
or 24 centuries ago even. And then, well, cynicism had a completely different meaning. It was a different form of laughter. Well, first of all, it was popular laughter, and so the cynics were the philosophers of the people, whereas Plato and Aristotle were the philosophers of the elite. the cynics were concerned with everyday morality. They preached very simple moral sayings which working people, poor people could use in their everyday life to address their challenges. So a very practical morality. And this morality was preached not with the use of very highbrow rationalistic arguments, but in a very hands-on performative way. So the practical joke is, of course, a very important tool in the methodological toolbox of the original cynics. So jokes, jovial laughter, practical jokes. That's very important, and I think one of the most famous cynics in history, although he is not usually considered as such, is of course Jesus of Nazareth, who was a moral philosopher, but who addressed the poor people with very simple sayings. You can't serve two masters at the same time. Don't care too much for tomorrow, focus on today. Well, very simple rules for poor people, how to live, how to lead their life in a world of turmoil and social disruption. And at the same time, he laughed more than we tend to think. And one famous example is, of course, the coin. Do we have to pay taxes? And that's a dilemma, because if he says yes, he seems to side with the Roman Empire. If he says no, he sides with Judaism, but at the same time, he seems to oppose Roman rule, etc. So that's a big dilemma. And he says, "Show me the rule. Show me the coin. What do I see? The emperor." Well, of course, everyone knows that on the coin there is the face of the emperor. He has this dramatic joke, this dramatic argument, saying, "Show me the coin. I see an emperor. So this coin belongs to the emperor. So let's pay taxes. The taxes, just do it. It doesn't mean anything. It's irrelevant. The coin already is the emperor. It's not part of you. It's not something which is relevant for you. It's not something that has to do with real life, with real existence." So a great example of a cynical joke, but cynical in the original meaning of the term. So practical, simple practical examples to solve dilemmas for people in everyday life. And this tradition has disappeared. Sometimes comedians still do this, but very often it's satire. It's a bit negative. And cynicism in the original term had, according to Peter Sloterdijk, this positive, liberating effect, like Jesus Christ. I don't worry anymore about whether or not I should pay taxes. I just do it, and I don't think about it anymore. It's not of my concern. It's not something which is important, which has anything to do with real life and real existence. And so that's a liberating thought. That's an example of Peter Sloterdijk's.
But isn't Sloterdijk himself a too much a serious philosopher?
No, I think Sloterdijk is an author who is sensitive to, let's say, the undercurrents of philosophical traditions. He is someone who retrieves, so to speak, concepts and traditions in the history of philosophy which we have forgotten and which were very appealing at a certain point. And he reminds us why these undercurrents, now forgotten, were very appealing and what they can still mean today. So that I think is already a very interesting exercise in retrieval, like retrieving the wisdom of the ancient cynics. Right. But at the same time, I think he's, of course, he's sometimes very provocative, but I think he is someone who really opens up the so-called consensus to see whether whether we really have been asking the questions we should have asked. And he dares to do that. And that makes him a bit infamous, so to speak, every now and then. But I think this is a very important role of a philosopher.
Right.
Philosophers have a very long tradition of siding, taking the sides, taking the side of the elite, those in power. Plato and Aristotle did that. And also many protagonists of liberalism. Think about John Stuart Mill, who wrote a book on liberty, at the same time was involved in colonialism in India. And Peter Sloterdijk is someone who provokes, but I think that helps us to ask the questions we really should be asking at a certain point, or even if it's difficult or painful to do so. And yes, I appreciate that very much. I am not always in agreement with his assessments, but well, that's what philosophy should be about: exposure to other possibilities.
So, Hub, my last question is something that you already mentioned, namely comedy. There is a huge interest in various forms of comedy, including sitcoms and stand-up comedies. Would you say that such genres are still relevant to public life or are reduced to private living rooms?
Which what's the word you use? Sorry.
Are they? I mean, like, we sit at home, we watch like sitcoms or stand-up comedies, or we go, yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah.
Do you think they are relevant to the concept of laughter that you're appreciating in the book? Or they feel like a reduced form of laughter?
Yeah, well, two comments about that. First of all, yes, I think comedians very often have this role that the jokes we only make at home when nobody is listening, so to speak, or among friends. We make a dangerous, risky joke, and we do that. Which, and we are very careful because we know it's a bit at odds with the dominant ideology. But these comedians do that in the open. They're provocative, and that means that people get angry, etc. And but that's their role. At the same time, I think well, comedians not always play this role as I would like them to play this role, because very often, I mean, their laughter remains a negative laughter, so criticizing, breaking down. But well, real laughter should be productive, should open up, should make things possible, should make life possible again. So rather than only criticizing, because it's always easy to criticize, but how should we live? How should we enjoy life again? And that's more difficult to explain. And I think a real comedian, yes, can be very critical, but also opens up pathways towards enjoying life in a sustainable way, and reconciling us with the pros and cons of living in the current era. And yeah, there should be this positive effect to laughter, which I sometimes miss in these very critical comedians.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Hub,